Раз, это хардбас, все в спортивках Адидас. И на Найке пацаны, слушаем хардбас басы. Этот стайл любимый, ждет все в ритме колбасы. 150 ударов тут, пацаны в спортивках ждут. Это школа колбасы, веселее, пацаны. Раз, это хардбас, все в спортивках Адидас. И на Найке пацаны, слушаем хардбас басы. Этот стайл любимый, ждет все в ритме колбасы. 150 ударов тут, пацаны в спортивках ждут. Школа танцев учит вас, правильно плясать хардбас. В клубе до утра топтать и ничего не принимать. Будьте рады из беды, наши злейшие враги. На площадках мы под хваст, отожгем для вас хардбас. Бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас. Отожгем для вас хардбас. Бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас. Отожгем для вас хардбас. Бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас. Отожгем для вас хардбас. Бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас, бас, бас, хардбас. Отожгем для вас хардбас.
Hello, chat. Can you hear me? As always, you always know I can never quite sort out the audio, so quick check if chat can hear me. First of all, the first video worked okay. Music, the visuals, the video worked, yes. Ones in chat if yes, twos if everything's bad and worse than before. So, before I start getting into spiel, I hear you. Awesome. Loud and clear. Great. We might get to the stage where I don't need to ask this at the start of every stream. Progressively, chat. Just a little bit of improvement with each stream, and maybe in 3 years, it'll be an acceptable quality of a stream. If the war goes on in 3 years. So, how is everyone? Is everyone doing well? Everything good? Awesome. Awesome. So, give me just a second, just while we wait for a couple more people to filter in before I get into the nitty and gritty of everything. I closed that browser? Yes, I did. Just as we're waiting for people to come in, how is everyone doing? It's cold here. It's snowy. And I only have ice cream to eat for dinner. Nice warm down in Florida. Lucky for someone. Just like Russian progress. Yeah, greetings from Brooklyn, New York. Greetings to you as well. Little crackly. Look. Is anyone else having a little bit of a cracking issue? Let me know if it improves. Just change that a little, see how that works there. Just the wire. Hopefully that is a little bit better. So, as we're just waiting for a couple more people to stream in. No, not better, or yes, no. What's the no to? Stinking hot here in New Zealand. It's not summer down there. Hello, Denmark. Hello. Slava Belfast. Yeah. I'm doing well. I just had ramen peas for breakfast. Okay. Just put out a final message here, and then we'll jump straight into what we're going to be discussing today. Audio is fine. Awesome. Hello from Romania. Hello to you back. Forgive me, I should have probably prepared this a little bit now. Your voice is a little choppy, actually. Why is that? Is it choppy compared to previous streams? if it is, I'm afraid I'm at a bit of a loss as to why that might be. I'll hear myself, see if it's coming through the same audio. So just give me a couple seconds while I just check this. Yes, I see what you mean. I'm not too sure why that's happening. Let's just turn down the gain just a little bit. Let's try that. Let me know if that's improved, and if it is. When you spoke up a bit there, it wasn't choppy. So is it whenever I speak loudly, or is your voice is a bit crackly, but not as okay? No, it's because I muted myself there just for a second. How's this now? Is it because I was a bit far from the microphone and it wasn't picking up the gain? Was that it? Hopefully, if that is sorted, I'll edit this out for whenever I come to make this into a video. Still no sound. Oh, I can hear it on my end. In fact, actually, that's a little bit quiet on my end. Hello, 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 hello. Right, there you go. Audio is fine. Sounds good. I think you were just a bit far from the mic. Yeah, I think that was it myself. So, hopefully, unless it's like there's still a problem, do let me know. But with that out of the side, I'm going to jump into what this stream is going to be discussing. So, it'll do. It's fine enough for a stream. I don't like it. It'll do. I'm hoping I'm not too sure why it's like this. I'm a bit angsty now. Well, I'll have a look into it and see if it improves. I'll try moving the mic a bit closer and speaking into it, chat. A bit of ASMR for me. So, for the sound is far. Okay, please start ranting about the war. So, yes, we're going to be ranting. Well, I'm going to be ranting about a particular front in the war that is potential. Certain stories have come out from the Russian angle about Russian forces massing in this front. For months now, there's also been claims that the Ukrainians are massing on this front for various reasons. And another, it's the Zaporozhzhia front, and I'll bring that up and we'll just jump straight into it then. I feel like I spent too much time trying to figure out the audio. So, first of all, this is mostly going to be, I know you guys love this, this is mostly going to be a map stream. We're going to be looking at maps and options that maps give us. Mic gain is a bit high, otherwise okay. Jesus Christ. Pardon me. Okay. So, for people who don't know the geography here, the southern part of the war here in southern Ukraine is along the Zaporozhye front line. This is Donetsk and Luhansk front lines in the east. This is where the vast majority of the fighting has been taking over the past couple months. Up here is Soledar in the news quite a lot. Here is Bakhmut in the news quite a lot. As you can see, I'll probably touch this on at the end of the stream whenever I come to round off recent events. The Russians have made a fairly significant breakthrough in terms of recent events to the south of Bakhmut, significantly endangering the H32 highway. If Wagner is able to push from the north and seriously contest the MO3 road here, Bakhmut will be in serious trouble at being cut off. This is a very small road. It's not even a road at all. There is smaller roads. I think this is actually a railway. Either way, that's the big news over the past week. Probably go into it at the end, but nonetheless, this is where the vast majority of the fighting takes place. You don't hear much about the southern part of the front, the Zaporozhye front line. Zaporozhye, of course, for autists, I'm sure as most of you are, if you watch and tolerate my terrible streams. will know that Zaporozhye, is one of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts that were, in terms of Russian legalistics, was formally annexed as a new federal subject of the Russian Federation, which is the vast majority down here. This is what remains of Russian-held Kherson. Of course, for people who are a bit more in tune with this kind of stuff, they'll know that while the Russians hold the majority of Zaporozhye Oblast, they don't hold the oblastal provincial, I'm not too sure what the correct term here is, but they don't hold the capital of the region, Zaporizhzhia city, which is, I think that's around about 20 to 30 miles north of the front line. Russian forces came close to the outskirts of the city during the opening stages of the war, but they did not seriously contest it. And ever since then, this front line has largely, ever since the ending of the siege in Mariupol, is largely stabilized into, I don't know if I'd call it a stalemate or what, but it's there's not been a lot of movement on this front line. The most that happens along here is Ukrainian HIMARS. Some Ukrainian HIMARS tend to be active in this area, trying to hit targets in Melitopol, and Russian logistics trains and the like heading up from this land bridge to continental Russia. At the start of the Donbass offensive, the Russians did attempt some small tactical advances here in Velika Novosilka, again forgive my horrific pronunciation, and another town called Hulalupol. That's how I'm going to choose to pronounce that. Sorry if it pisses anyone off. But as you can see, it didn't really get anywhere significantly. I don't know if I'd even call this as part of the Zaporozhye front line, but down here in this sort of area here is, if people remember, there was a lot of fighting over a town called Palivka. That's in this sort of area. It's kind of on the crux between Zaporozhye front and the Donetsk front. So there's been recent reports that the Russians might be thinking of doing an offensive in this area, and I think that's actually probably one of the more wiser options that the Russians have open to them. I think it might be a bit too late to properly exploit what could have been exploited earlier in the war, but we'll go into that. So I'm sure, as most people who follow this day in day out will know, that the Russians for months now have been slamming their heads against the strongest of the strong Ukrainian defenses, the stuff that's been built up over 8 years along this red line, which is the former front line before February 24th. It took around about a month for the Russians to break through in Popasna, which then allowed them to take up and flank Lysychansk, collapse Ukrainian defenses in this area. But then the Ukrainians were able to solidify a new defensive line, the Bakhmut defensive line, which has held since around about July, if not even before that, ever since, with the Russians and especially the Wagner leading the assault, slamming their head against this very rock-solid defensive line. This stream's going to be a bit more of speculation and more what I would do, what I would have done, because the one person who probably knows better than the Russian military high command is me, an autistic spurg sitting behind his computer in Western Europe. But nonetheless, we're just going to take it for what it's worth. One thing which I think the Russians really missed out on was the way they conducted that opening offensive in the Donbass. This is the offensive after the pullout from the north and eastern Ukraine, whenever the initial Russian invasion pretty catastrophically failed its opening goals, and the Russians redirected to this area. I think the Russians really missed a trick here by going for this very slow, methodical artillery attritional grind. To be fair to the Russians, I guess it's because they didn't have enough men to properly support the offensive I kind of had envisaged. If people go back and watch a video I did, I think it is from May last year. It's called Russian Offensive Failing ? offensive options open or something like that, where I speculated what I thought the Russians might have done and what I think would have achieved a fairly significant result for the Russians. The hypothesis I'm going with is that the Russians have kind of ceded the initiative in the war by reverting to this very slow, attritional, grinding artillery dual warfare, which I don't think has served the Russians very well. What I think the Russians should have done is reconstituted their battalion tactical groups in that month that they had after the pullout of the north of Kiev, brought in as much fresh troops as they could into this southern area in Zaporozhye, into this part where, if people can remember that far back, it's coming up to like almost a year, shy a few months since it happened. But whenever the Russian offensive to Kharkov failed pretty spectacularly, what was a bit overlooked at the time is that the Russian advance kind of veered to the east and made some pretty decent gains to in this area, which they subsequently lost in September, but nonetheless, back in the start of summer last year, this opened up options to the Russians. The Russians pushed down, took Izium. There was some serious discussion that the Russians might try and make a play for Slovyansk and Kramatorsk from the north, and they were pushing down to a town, I completely forget, I think it was this one, but yes, that was the one because I had trouble pronouncing that. The Russians started to make a push down towards this town, and I kind of seen that as an indication that the Russians were going for a pretty massive encirclement. And I think maybe the manpower issue meant it was never realistic, but nonetheless, I think the Russians could have achieved something a bit more with it. So the time frame, I know this is a bit of a history lesson as such, and it's more of a I told you so kind of portion of the stream, but nonetheless I think it's a bit valuable for what is potentially going to happen. So we're talking about late April into May last year. This was a fresh front line. Forgive me. The Russians, well, more the DNR and the Russian naval infantry, and to a degree the Chechens, were still heavily invested in taking Mariupol. This was a fresh front line that had only recently been established in the previous weeks at the time. So what Ukrainian defenses here would have been fairly light on the ground. Few minefields, a couple of territorial defense battalions, a couple of, a few Ukrainian regular army battalions put up in a picket defense line just to kind of check any Russian offensive into this area and try and, I don't think at that time they would have been able to contain it, but certainly to attempt to slow it down. So the two factors of what I'm pointing at here is this area where the Russians did launch their offensive, I think was pretty foolish, because this is the heaviest of the Ukrainian defensive line. It was really slowed down the Russian army, military, the DNR, and their associated allies. It slowed them down to a crawl. It became an extremely grinding war of attrition that wore down some of the better units of the Russian military and also the DNR and LNR militias especially. And I keep saying, people in the Telegram channel keep saying, oh, well, how can Ukraine win whenever Russia is sustaining firing 60,000 artillery shells a day? That isn't as good a statistic as people might think on the face of it. Those artillery shells need to be replaced. They wear down barrels. If you're firing that many artillery shells, it kind of says that you're not actually achieving much, that you're having to rely too much on trying to destroy targets, and you're not clearly destroying those targets with artillery if you're having to fire so many shells at it. So people who brag about the Russians being able to fire so many artillery shells a day, just a little bit of nuance, that's not really a good statistic. Yeah, it shows the Russians have a lot of guns, but it also shows that potentially they're not achieving a lot with those guns. So that was a big wear on Russian artillery stocks, on ammunition, on supply, this whole offensive into the Donbass. Whereas what I would have done, because I'm the kind of, me sitting behind a computer seemingly I have the insights into all this stuff, but nonetheless, I would have thought this would have been a better option, because as I was saying, if the Russians were able to mass dozens of battalion tactical groups in this area, my original plan in the stream I did do, and this is before it became really apparent at just how bad the Russian manpower was at the time, was I sort of envisaged that the Russians would have made a big push from the south. The Russian advance here from the north would have made a push to the southwest, and the Russians would have linked up somewhere around this area and completely encircled the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, completely circumventing the Ukrainian defensive lines without the need to go through them, and encircling a significant amount of the regular Ukrainian army, at the time the best trained, most of the best equipped troops. If the Russians were then able to achieve that and then held a defensive line and just slowly attritioned out, starved these guys into surrender, I think that would have been, I won't say that would have won the war, but it would have significantly crippled Ukraine for a significant amount of time afterwards. But that is just conjecture, because as I just said, the Russians really didn't seem to have the manpower at the time potentially to have achieved that kind of massive war of maneuver and encirclement. I think they definitely had the equipment, as brutal as the opening invasion might have been on Russian vehicle stocks. I think they had more than enough BTRs, BMPs, and tanks to achieve this kind of war of maneuver, but I just, in hindsight, I don't think they would have had the infantry. Pardon me. I always get a cough whenever I do streams. I don't think they had the infantry to support the vehicles in this grand encirclement. So, my original plan, I will concede, probably not very realistic in hindsight, looking at the Russian manpower issue at the time, which kind of says that the Russians should have mobilized on day one of the war, if not like a month before the war, but then that would have completely dissuaded the element of surprise. But then again, this goes into conjecture of just how badly the Russians prepared for the war to begin with. So, with that idea that the grand offensive to the north probably would have not have achieved much and probably been a disaster due to Russian manpower, I still think the Russians should have pushed from the south, and seen how far they could have gotten reasonably. And this will kind of feed into what I think the Russians should probably do now. So we're talking about still May, April last year. If the Russians kept feeding troops into this northern advance and kept pushing to the west, this would have caused the Ukrainians to significantly, again, I know I'm kind of saying, well, the Russians should have attempted the thing I just said that they probably couldn't have achieved. Well, I think instead of a massive advance to try and completely encircle, I think the Russians should have done a sort of recon and force, seen how far they could have gotten to a significant line that they could have held, and flanked Sloviansk to the very least. Maybe they could have crossed this small river here and sort of enveloped Kramatorsk from the west. That would have put a significant amount of strain on Ukrainian defenses along this part of the Donbass. Probably would have caused potentially elements of the Ukrainian army to abandon at the time Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, and maybe this sort of pocket area here, to pull back and reinforce the twin cities to the west. It would have stretched Ukrainian lines, but at the same time it would have significantly stretched Russian lines. From the south, I think the Russians, again, the point I'm trying to make here is that if the Russians did do an offensive here, I think they would have achieved quite a significant amount of territory they could have taken. They wouldn't have been slowed down by heavily emplaced Ukrainian positions, and it would have stretched Ukrainian supply lines, and at the time, the cohesion of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass by trying to contest so many different sectors being pushed on it at once. So what they could have achieved at the time, who knows? That we'll have to wait probably years until we get significant documentation from the Russian side to figure out just how much troops and equipment and stocks they could have had for an offensive of this like. But nonetheless, that's a bit of the hindsight conjecture out of the way. What do I think the Russians should do now? Pardon me. Just going to take a quick drink. So we're almost coming up 9 months out from this. The Ukrainians have reinforced this line to a significant degree. There are skirmishes back and forth here and there, but like I say, the big main thing is that the Ukrainians use this front line to fire HIMARS at Russian targets in supply networks around Melitopol, Tomak. Berdyansk, I think, is probably out of range for HIMARS. I think that's more the Tochkas that fire at Berdyansk these days. But so I do think that the Ukrainians probably don't have they won't have a defensive line in the same sense as Bakhmut or Soledar, but at the same time, I don't think the Russians would have a significantly entrenched front line here as well. The way the fighting in the Donbass has been conducted, especially by the Wagner group, is the way I'm sort of viewing it at this stage, which will have to be confirmed whenever the offensive does come or not, is that the Russians, particularly the Wagner group, is trying to tie down the focus of the Ukrainian army on the Donbass front. This is why there's a big song and dance about Russian troops in Belarus, why the Russians keep seemingly driving tanks and mechanized infantry divisions in fields in Belgorod and Kursk to keep the Ukrainians having to put garrisons along these borders in case the Russians ever do try and cross them again. I think this is all part of, ironically, I actually think this is a strategic feint. I do not anticipate Russian troops or Belarusian troops to come from the north anytime soon, or from Kursk, from Belgorod, back across into Ukraine. I think it's all just a strategic feint employed to tie down as much Ukrainian assets as possible, essentially wasting them, for lack of a better term. Whereas in the south, the information for it is scant at the moment. I've only seen a few reports of it, which has kind of excited me, but again, we'll have to wait and see. The offensive is imminent, and I've seen a few reports from various sources saying that it's going to come in Zaporozhye. At the same time, there's also word that the Ukrainians are potentially going to do their offensive in Zaporozhye, but nonetheless, one thing to bear in mind is whenever the Russians pulled out of Kherson, the Russian troops, the VDV, all the Russian units that were deployed on the Kherson front line, which were very good units, just to give you another bit of hindsight, if people can remember back to the offensive in Kherson, this was extremely stressed logistically. The Antonovsky Bridge and the pontoon ferry beside it was really the only sustainable-ish logistics supply line for the Russian troops in Kherson. So they were always short of munitions. To a degree, they were short of reinforcements. Yet despite that, the Russian forces on the Kherson front line, we've never gotten the confirmation on what the Ukrainians lost, but in terms of visually confirmed stuff, they lost a significant amount of particularly Western donated equipment, thinking of the M113s, the Czech and Polish supplied T-72Ms. They suffered particularly high losses on the Kherson front. There was a bit of a collapse on the northern flank of the front at one point, but largely the Kherson front did hold. And I think that's a testament to the proficiency and the skill of the Russian troops that were holding it at the time, surprisingly, considering the state of much of the Russian army throughout this war. But these troops have largely disappeared since that offensive. They haven't really shown up anywhere else in the war. So if you remember, the Kherson front kind of ended, November last year? We're coming up to around about 2 months. Effectively an entire Russian army group has mysteriously disappeared. I would imagine they're being reconstituted, potentially trained up, reinforced, and preparing for a coming offensive. On the flip side, the Ukrainian army group that was pushing into Kherson has also kind of disappeared. They have been deploying, particularly through Zaporozhye and Dnipro. They are somewhere in this area, and they are also projected to be part of the coming offensive for the Ukrainians as well. So there's at least one fairly battle-hardened army group for each side from the Kherson front. The Ukrainians probably lost more men and equipment, but then again, I think the Ukrainian troops that went into the Kherson offensive were not as skilled or as trained as the Russian ones that opposed them. So I think the Russian troops that were pulled out were probably of a better quality than the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians are probably better motivated, but nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is these are probably very good quality troops on both sides. These are not going to be the Mobics, the mobilized, the territorial defense battalions on the Ukrainian side. These are going to be the vanguard, I would imagine, of any coming Ukrainian offensive or Russian offensive. Then behind that, when the offensive does come on either side, if it does achieve a breakthrough, that's whenever you'll get the mobilized in the territorial defense troops pushing through to bolster the advance and to exploit any progress. So now, as this is mostly focusing on the Russian angle of things, this is going to be conjecture on my point, because of course this offensive hasn't started yet from the Russian side of things. So I can only really conjecture about what I think would be a very good potential, what's the word I'm looking for? My hypothesis for what the Russians should do and why I think it would be a very good idea. So, there is a town here called Avalis. That's not it. Kamyansky. Where's Vasilivka? Oh, that's it there. Vasilivka. This crossing here, this town here, this is where all the prisoner swaps happen. This is where refugees earlier in the war were allowed to freely transit one side or the other. This is kind of under, although this is reporting that there's been artillery from the Russians, but nonetheless, there is kind of an agreed ceasefire of sorts set on this area. From my understanding, it's once you cross this bridge, up to this bridge, this area here is kind of a no man's land. Back in April, the commanders on both sides, tactical commanders, were able to establish this sort of tacit agreement that this was going to be a place where there would be exchange of wounded, exchange of prisoners, and at the time, refugees were allowed to transit through this corridor. There is still prisoner exchanges that happen here, but I think this is, at least if I was in charge, I think that's probably, this window is going to close. At least I would be closing it, because I think what the Russians should be doing is massing the troops from the VDV and the troops from the Kherson front, build up a bulk of mobilized forces as well, bring in, I think the battalion tactical group system has effectively broken down and doesn't really exist as such anymore. But nonetheless, is that the Russians need to, and I would hope they have, well, hope is probably not the right word, but I would expect that the Russians have been rebuilding a new kind of maneuver unit, a unit of high mobility, because I think what would do the Russians very well is if they made an offensive to take Zaporozhye, well, not, how do I word this? If I was the Russians, what I would be looking to do is to do an offensive onto Zaporizhzhia city. Not to take the city. The object is not to take the city at all. It is to invest the city and put it under siege. So, I will explain my sort of reasoning behind this. So if we take round about this part of the front, say up to roughly around this area, so around about 30 miles of the front line, if the Russians were able, depending on what the minefields, because I expect the Ukrainians have put a lot of them up, depending on what the Ukrainian defenses are, the Russians, if I was in charge, would start doing probing attacks along this part of the front here. Slowly build up those probing attacks to figure out where along the front line there's a bit of a weakness, and when there is a weakness, exploit that weakness, push in the elite, the most trained, the battle hardened Russian vanguard forces, the VDV, people from the Kherson front, supported with the most modern and effective Russian artillery that they can muster. I'm not talking about the MSTABs, I'm talking about things like Smersh, the tornado system. Yeah, the MSTA, the self-propelled artillery variant, not the towed cannon, because needs to be a mobile offensive. The total scope of what I'm looking at is potentially around about 60 miles. In terms of what the war has been like for the past half a year, yeah, that's quite a lot of territory, but in terms of modern warfare, it's really not that much. So I would expect it shouldn't strain Russian logistics lines too much to extend it 60 miles to the north. So my idea is that the Russians should try and make a push for Zaporozhye city. If they're able to achieve a breakthrough here, what I would envisage and what I think would be a very good idea is the Russians are able to make a breakthrough is they come to the suburbs of Zaporozhye city and they stop. They don't enter the city. They don't look to take the city, at least not immediately. As the Russians approach the southern end of the city, they push up along to this river, push along the river, secure as many crossings as they can, cross the river, and just envelop the city, push up. I think that river there is the one I think I worked out originally was a fairly decent defensive line from the north. So the Russians would push up, hug the Dnieper as much as they can while they push to the north, avoid the city, create a circle around the city, effectively put the city under siege from the east, try and push a bit north until they find a more defensive position, start to push east, try and expand this bulge in the Ukrainian line as much as they can to the east, probably along to this river, form a new defensive line so that the Russians now have this large jut out into Ukraine. Now, why am I thinking of this? Why do I think this would be a good idea for the Russians? I'm looking at this on a strategic level. Alongside this, the opening of this Russian offensive, what I would do if I was the Russian Supreme Commander in this is, I don't think bastions in calibers would have the strength in them, but those fancy Russian hypersonic missiles that they keep bandering on about, I would use those to hit these bridges. The Russians would want to destroy these bridges completely. Any crossing from the west, that is a dam, but this part of the dam is a bridge. So if that could be destroyed, and then there's another bridge angle here. If the road spans of these bridges of this dam here could be destroyed, you would effectively cut off Zaporozhye completely and effectively put it under siege. Alongside this is the way I'm looking at it is on a wider strategic scale, but also on a political and a tactical scale for the Russians. So a few days ago, I went all the way up the Dnieper and counted every single bridge, and the numbers escape me for the moment. But from Zaporizhzhia all the way up to Kiev, something like 500 miles to the north, there is only something like 15 to 16 bridges across the Dnieper, the entire span. Again, I'm not too sure the power of a Kizil missile, the hypersonic missiles, but if they are powerful enough to collapse bridges and they are accurate enough to do that, I think this is the time where the Russians want to start doing it, because I'll come on to that part after this. So if the Russians hypothetically are able to start collapsing bridges on the Dnieper all the way up it and push the Ukrainian logistics line further and further north into fewer and fewer bridges, it puts significantly more strain on it. Also, if the Russians are able to achieve this quasi-encirclement of Zaporizhzhia, well, this will then become a bleeding wound to the Ukrainians. Drones and satellites and all that, the Russians don't really seem to use satellites, but they do have quite a lot of drones. Is what the Russians, in my kind of estimation of this and my sort of mind theory of this, is they want to have the Ukrainians to be able to feed men and resources into this city. So if they can collapse the spans of the bridges, or at least put the bridges enough out of action so that the Ukrainians can't put trucks and tanks across them, then this would become a bleeding wound. So if you think about it, you'll have I know this is a bit grim, but it's war. You'll have tens of thousands of civilians in here that will have to be fed. You'll have the defenders of the city that will have to be fed, resupplied, and reinforced. Well, whenever the Ukrainians try and bring reinforcements and equipment across these bridges, across the river, in ferries and pontoons, well, they're going to be sitting ducks to Russian artillery. That's going to be it's going to take a lot of attrition out of the Ukrainians. So the idea of Zaporozhye city is you turn it into a bleeding wound for the Ukrainians. Either the Ukrainians just decide to de-invest the city and then somehow try to evacuate the 100,000 soldiers and civilians out of the city, which will be it won't be easy. And I can imagine the Russians will probably tear shreds out of them. Or they try and hold the city, and then the city is just a killing ground for Ukrainian assets put into the city. So that is one aspect of it. Also, sooner or later, if the Russians do take that city, well, then the Russians will be able to claim that they have legitimately taken the capital of a Ukrainian oblast that has since been annexed to the Russian Federation. So there's a potential propaganda win further down the line for the Russians on this. Also, another aspect on a more localized and regional scale, the Russians, even if they aren't able to destroy the bridges, but I mean, if a hypersonic missile, and looking at the size of them, going by the result of that Ukrainian ammo dump that was hit back in March last year, I don't see why some of these bridges couldn't be significantly damaged, if not spans taken down, if they're hit by the Kizil, if they're as accurate as they say, and the Russians have as many of them as they say. I don't see why these bridges or spans of the bridges can't be destroyed. So even if the bridges aren't destroyed and the Russians are able to envelop the city from the east, well, that is a major logistics line for the Ukrainians to the Donbass and to the wider war in the east that has now been cut off. So if you, just to give you an idea of this, so at the moment, supply to the Donbass comes from Romania, it comes from Poland, it comes from the west. Stuff coming up from Romania tends to go via Dnipro and Zaporozhye. Stuff from Poland tends to go via Kiev, and I think some of it comes from Kremenchuk. These are train lines, these are tanks, these supplies, stuff like that. Well, if you take Zaporozhye out of the works, if you cut off these bridges, whether you destroy them, whether you invest the city and cut the roads to the east, this pushes more traffic north into Dnipro. It's going to put more strain on the logistics system here. Again, if the Russians are able to destroy the bridges or not, it's open to conjecture at this stage. But nonetheless, it pushes more strain further upstream, puts more pressure on the Ukrainian logistics network. So if the Russians do achieve this, instead of logistics just crossing the bridges from Zaporozhye and just going straight into the southern part of the Zaporozhye front line, they would then have to go up to Dnipro, probably along this main route. Well, if this road's going to be cut by this hypothetical scenario, they'd then have to go to Pavlohrad, and then further down, putting more time, more stress, more pressure on Ukrainian logistics trains. That's the kind of angle I'm looking at. So that's kind of phase 1 and 2 of what if I was in charge of the Russian angle of things, of what I would do in this, of a Zaporozhye offensive, create this bleeding sore for the Ukrainians to deal with, and then potentially, if things go surprisingly well, start to push east and start to push to the north, to the northeast. Potentially the Russians could also push further up to Dnipro, but at that stage I think the Russians would probably start to be running out of steam. Also, the other thing to be mindful here is Ukrainian HIMARS especially, and Ukrainian artillery on the western bank will be very active, and you could potentially have some Russian counter battery on the south, but the further the Russians try and push up at this narrow advance that I'm sort of envisaging here, the more vulnerable it comes to Ukrainian HIMARS and artillery strikes. So the Russians are able to make a bit of an effort up here and achieve kind of what I I've hypothesized in this scenario, then to me it would make sense for the Russians to then push to the east and expand their bridgehead further to the east, undermining Ukrainian defensives along the entire south of the front, but also opening up these roads and transport links and logistics networks to resupply and reinforce further out of range of Ukrainian HIMARS and artillery batteries. Also, it might open up a bit of a golden opportunity for the Russians. For people who seem to be convinced that the Russian MOD's daily briefings are the word of God and that the Russians have destroyed every single Ukrainian HIMARS battery 2 times over. No, that's not happening. There's not been a single report, the actual credible report of a single HIMARS being destroyed so far during the war. But what the Russians potentially could do, what could open up an angle for this. So the HIMARS has an 80-kilometer range. So you're talking about they'll be somewhere around this here area if they're going to be fairly effective in what they might be able to do. Is whenever this offensive starts out, at least the hypothetical offensive that I'm kind of envisaging here is, well, this is going to be the hot button topic. So this is where Ukrainian HIMARS batteries, potentially the M270s as well, will be deployed and trying to work their magic along here. Well, if the Russians are able to put up significant drones up into this area without them all getting shot down, maybe they could actually find a lock on one of them and bring in Lancets, counter battery fire, whatever it may be, to actually take some of those HIMARS out of action. Because this is a significantly smaller area potentially to cover. It still is a massive area. Just to say, like, this is hundreds of square kilometers here. But the difference between this sort of nub is it's kind of invested from 3 sides, especially if the Russians achieve what I hypothetically see them achieving here. This is a significantly smaller area than, say, what the Russians had to deal with in Kherson. So if people remember back whenever the Antonovsky Bridge was being hit daily and at some stages every 6 hours by HIMARS, the HIMARS had this entire area here from which they could operate, scoot and shoot from. So, that's a potential option that the Russians could start to look at here. And like I was saying, if the Russians are able to achieve, again, just the caveat, this is all speculation. This hasn't happened yet. This may not happen. This is just kind of what my game plan is as to what I think might be a good idea for the Russians to do in this offensive. If the Russians are able to achieve this and start to push to the east, they will start to wrap up the entire Ukrainian defensive line to the south, depending on what the Ukrainians are able to do, whether they decide to launch a counter-offensive into the Russian offensive, who knows? But to me, this is kind of where the Russians could really start to achieve something and start to get a bit of initiative back into their war effort. Really put the Ukrainians potentially back onto the back foot. And on the aspect of what happens in the Donbass, well, again, one, you've taken out one of the major logistics supply points, and also you've undermined the entire southern flank of the Donbass front. So one thing leads to another. If the Russians do achieve something pretty decent down here, they could then start to look to push to the northeast and directly into the rear of the Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass. So that's one kind of way I've been looking at this. So I know this has kind of been more of a hypothetical speculation stream on what I personally would do if I was in charge, because, you know, me, Spurg, behind a computer has the best view of things and everything, but that's just kind of one angle I've been thinking about this. And to me, I think the Zaporozhzhia front is probably one of the best areas for the Russians to launch an offensive. If the Russians just decide to go back into the Donbass and throw another offensive straight into the Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass, yeah, hypothetically, if they throw it at Bakhmut looks like it might be in the potential of falling in the not too distant future. I guess the Russians could exploit that breakthrough and start to push troops through it. But as I've been cautioning people for months, the fighting here has gone on so long that the Ukrainians have erected, at least I would be very, very surprised if the Ukrainians have not erected as strong defensive positions behind Bakhmut and all the way along the Donbass in several layers in a defense in depth system going all the way back to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. So to me, if the Russians decide to throw another offensive straight into the hardest of the hard defenses that the Ukrainians have, well, they're just going to have a repeat of last summer, where they slowly get worn down and lose the initiative and then get blindsided by Ukrainian offensive. So I think keep Wagner doing what it's doing. And it should be stressed that what's happening in the Donbass now is largely the Wagner group, supported by the DNR to the south and elements of the LNR militia as well. But the Russian army is largely absent from what is happening around Bakhmut and Soledar outside of artillery. It's Wagner who are the infantry on the ground making the push. So the Russian army is absent from this field of the Russian infantry. Frontline troops are absent from this part of the war. So the question is where are they? And I think they're most likely being sent south to Zaporozhye. This stream has mostly been my hypothetical of what a scenario here could look like. The Russians could do a completely different thing in Zaporozhye. We'll have to wait and see. That's all speculation at this stage. But I think Zaporozhye is probably the best angle for this way to go, because further to the north, if the Russians do an offensive here, what is to be achieved? Yep, they'll retake ground, but there is significant Ukrainian troops up here, and I think an offensive would just slowly be bogged down in the trees around Kharkov, pushing back into Liman and Kupiansk. And ultimately, I don't think there is significant strategic implications for the Russians to retake this area at this stage. So even on the best case scenario, let's say if the Russians do launch an offensive back on the Kharkov front, yep, one definitely good thing that would be achieved is they would push the Ukrainians back from Savuttoy and Kremenia from the P66 road and stabilize this front and the Russian supply line from the north. But let's say if the Russians retake Liman, retake Izyum, okay, well, we're just back at the same position as we were through all summer into autumn last year, where, yeah, the Russians held this area, but they didn't really do much with it. It was kind of undermanned, under-resourced, and they didn't exploit it to any significant degree. They didn't make a push down to Slovyansk. They didn't make a push to Kramatorsk. They didn't make a push significantly back up towards Kharkov. This is just kind of dead ground, as it were. If anything, it's probably better to reinforce this defensive line. Maybe try and do a localized offensive to try and push back up to this river and the reservoir here, because rivers and reservoirs tend to be far more defensive than just open ground or forest area. So that might be an angle there to make a more defensive, cohesive line along that area. But ultimately, I don't see the strategic implications of the Russians making another push into Kharkov. Then comes the other aspect. What if the Russians decide to come in from Belarus? I think I did a previous stream. I don't know if it's still up. And I'm kind of very skeptical of the idea. The Russians didn't achieve very much whenever they did it the first time round, with the element of surprise. And with arguably better equipment then, which they since lost in the effort than they have now. There is a slow build-up of Russian troops in Belarus, but it's not the 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 at least that the Russians would need to make this effort significantly worth it. And then also on top of this, if people can remember back to my very early streams, if you have been here long enough, my streams from February and March last year, where I went on Google Earth and individually went down each and every road from Belarus into Kiev. I didn't really do it in this area, but it doesn't look like there's many here. Any Russian effort into northern and western Ukraine is going to be hit by the same problem that it was originally. Very poor logistics. There's actually surprisingly little roads, and the roads that do cross the border from Belarus into Ukraine are fairly small, and also now they are mined, they are defended, they are covered with Ukrainian anti-tank munitions, and defensives of all kinds. So a Russian effort out of Belarus, I don't think is going to be coming anytime soon. People have speculated it might come further to the west. I think I did another stream where I kind of just shot that out of hand. Any Russian effort, even if the Belarusians came in alongside into Western Ukraine, is just it's folly. It's just a defeat. There's no way that the Russians. Yes, some fanciful ideas some people have is that the Russians are somehow going to push down all the way across Western Ukraine to the Romanian border and cut off supply from Poland. I don't think the Russians are going to advance 700 miles through Western Ukraine, where they are the most hated, and where they're going to be attacked from the east and from the west. It's just not a feasible idea. There is some speculation that the Russians might come in back towards Sumy, out of Kursk and Bryansk. Again, I don't think it's that feasible. For what purpose? You'll start a new front in the war, I guess. But apart from drawing Ukrainian forces north, what is it really going to achieve? I don't think the Russians have long-term designs on Sumy and Chernihiv, considering how they abandoned them back in March and April last year. They could make another play for Kharkov city itself. Coach Red Pill, I'm sure, would love that, but I don't, again, looking at what they achieved the first time round, with the complete collapse of the previous Kharkov front, you can bet that this border is probably one of the most defended borders in the world at this stage, completely mined, covered with all kinds of fancy Western equipment. Probably not a very feasible aspect. So the only real option that I'm seeing, and again, don't knock something because you can't see it. It would have to be very surprising if the Russians hit somewhere else and achieve something with it. It would be very surprising. To me, Zaporozhye is kind of really the only option, but also one of the options that presents the most. Because, one, this bleeding sore potentially around Zaporozhye and cutting off logistics, and if the Russians are able to start seriously damaging, if not taking out, bridges across the Dnieper, the Russians are against the clock. And I know this is going to be a point of severe contention in my chat. People who are not going to like what I'm going to say. But Russia is running against the clock. The Western equipment to Ukraine is increasing in capability and in number as time goes on. There are now it's only a squadron of 14 tanks, but there are Challenger 2s going to Ukraine. There's talk of Abrams going to Ukraine. We're probably going to see Leopard 2s okayed by the Germans, be it from the Poles, from the Germans themselves, or from other operators of the Leopards. We're probably very likely in the near future going to see NATO states starting to supply Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Depending on the numbers, nonetheless, this is a significant upgrade in what the Ukrainians have. To go from T-62s or T-72Ms up to Challenger 2s, Leopards, and before long, I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans are going to start putting Abrams on the docket. These tanks are nothing that the Russians have really faced before. The capabilities that they present is significantly upgraded, depending on what models of the tanks that the Western states start to supply to Ukraine. This isn't really a tank war because everyone's carrying anti-tank weapons, but tanks aren't being used as they conventionally are being used. But nonetheless, anything short of the most modern T-72s or the T-90s are going to seriously struggle if they come face to face with these tanks, and it's going to significantly upgrade Ukrainian capabilities. That's with the caveat that it'll probably be at least a year, at the very least, before these tanks have trained Ukrainian crews to operate them to a decent capability. But nonetheless, we are under a month from the start of the war as it stands. So there is a bit of a time constraint starting to come in. Alongside this, you have the Bradleys going to Ukraine. Only 50, but 50 is a fairly decent amount. And I know people likes to write off the Bradley as a bit of junk or whatever, the Bradley is actually a pretty decent bit of equipment. It's very large, so it is a big target, and who knows, it's never really been tested against properly trained and modern Russian equipment. But in Iraq, during the first Gulf War, the Bradley was very effective at destroying, it was Soviet monkey models, but the Bradley with the TOW missile was able to significantly damage and degrade Iraqi Soviet armor. Of course, every war since, the Bradley has been fighting against people who are planting IEDs and people who ride about in donkeys, and yet still were able to defeat the Americans in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, the Bradley is a very good, very capable bit of equipment. It's what the Ukrainians are asking for. It's able to deploy men, equipment, deploy infantry rapidly into battle. That Bushmaster cannon on it is fairly effective. If a Bradley and a BMP-2 come into contact with each other, I think that's whenever it's going to be, I'm not going to say the Bradley's better than the BMP-2 or the BMP-2 is better than the Bradley. The BMP-2, I think, probably has the advantage that it's a significantly smaller vehicle, but both of them have a very similar cannon. Both of them carry anti-tank weapons. Both of them carry infantry into the battle. Both of them are battle-tested. The Bradleys are a significant step up from the M1111s that the Ukrainians have been up. M1111s, or is it the M113? What is that APC the Dutch gave them? M113, yeah, sorry. The M113s the Dutch gave them doesn't carry its own gun, probably apart from a 50 caliber put on top of it. A Bradley has a 25mm Bushmaster cannon, which has a bit of a decent weight to it, alongside the BMP-2, of course. Alongside this, there is serious discussion starting to emerge at the Americans, who have just retired Stryker, the Stryker combat platform, of which I believe there's something like 4,000 units, might start to send those to Ukraine before long. Alongside this, there is discussions that the Jordanians, who have just retired their Challenger 1 tanks, that there are unnamed Western states are starting to float the idea with the Jordanians that those tanks might suddenly start to turn up in Ukraine. The point is what I'm trying to make, because I know everyone in my chat really hates this idea that they seem to think that Ukrainians are like sub 20 IQ, barely human monkeys who can't do less slat or anything, despite the fact they can pull off things like the Kharkov offensive. The point is that Ukraine is, as time goes on, it's getting more equipment, more sophisticated equipment from the West. It's no longer talking about T-72Ms. It's now talking about potentially Leopards, Challengers, both 1 and 2, Bradleys. Ukraine is moving away from the sort of ad hoc post-Soviet army to a NATO standard army. And a lot of the Russians, the point is what I'm trying to make is, so far the Russians have trouble dealing with the Ukrainian army as it is and at the start of the war. Well, if it's not, we're now going to be seeing potentially in a year the Ukrainians driving about in Abrams and Challengers and in Bradleys. It's not going to be good for the Russians. I'm not saying these things will win the war for the Ukrainians. I know people like this great straw man that, what is 14 Challengers going to do? Win the war? Not more Western Wunderwaffe? And it's like, okay, guys, like if you can't, if that's as far as your dialectic goes in this, it is a step up for Ukrainian ability here and there. It's tangential at times, but every time that the West has announced a support package, particularly the Americans, but now the British, every time that they have announced a support package to the Ukrainians, it increases each, basically on a monthly basis now. So this month it's 14 Challengers. Next month we're probably going to get 50 Leopard 2s announced. And again, probably at least a year, at least, most optimistic, before Ukrainian crews come into these tanks and use them to any capable standard. But that is now a year that the Russians have to run against to significantly degrade the Ukrainian army to make up for the appearance of those systems on the battlefield. So part of that is if the Russians are able to create a bleeding wound here, where the Ukrainians have to focus combat power, logistics, reinforcements, supply to hold this city or to evacuate this city, whatever it may be, well, that's going to put more strain on the Ukrainian military in general. If the Russians are able to start collapsing bridges across the Dnieper, if that is even feasible to begin with, well, let's just say every bridge, hypothetically, south of Kiev has been destroyed or out of action to anything larger than a car. You can walk across them, but you can't drive a car across them. Okay? Well, that's going to put significant strain on these bridges in Kiev. And then they have hundreds of miles to transport not only military equipment and reinforcement, civilian supply, food, medical goods, everything that the civilian population of Ukraine east of the Dnieper, which is tens of millions of people, it's going to put a lot of strain on the Ukrainians. Strain on the Ukrainians makes things easier for the Russians going forward. So this is why the way the Russians have conducted their strategic bombing campaigns is very schizophrenic to me. Like, if people can remember back to whenever the Russians went hitting all the Ukrainian strategic oil reserves, and it lasted about a month and a half. No, not a month, a week and a half, and then the Russians gave up. And then over the autumn and the winter, the Russians then decided to hit the Ukrainian electrical grid. They kept up that under Surovikin for about two weeks, being generous, about 3 weeks, and then that started to tail off. If the Russians are going to start doing a new strategic bombing campaign, I think the best targets at this stage will be bridges across the Dnieper. And again, if there is a weapon system that the Russians have that are able to do that, I would imagine the Kizil hypersonic missile would be the thing to do it. I'm just going off what I seen at the time, but if that thing was able to penetrate an underground Ukrainian munitions bunker in Western Ukraine back in March last year, I don't see why that thing couldn't potentially be pretty good at significantly degrading, if not collapsing, the span of a bridge. And if the Russians have stocks of those, I can't think of any better target than the bridges across the Dnieper. The moral aspect of this is it might end up creating a massive famine and significant humanitarian crisis for the Ukrainian population to the east of the Dnieper. But I think at this stage, both sides, especially the Russians, don't really care about the humanitarian aspects of the Ukrainian population. So if the Russians are looking to significantly win this war, they need to isolate everything east of the Dnieper and put as much strain on the Ukrainians going forward. If the Ukrainians are hurting to get fuel, ammunition, food, reinforcements into this front line, if they're struggling to keep equipment in the field, well then, if and when very fuel-hungry Leopard 2s, Abrams, Challenger 2 start to turn up, well, if they can't really exercise proper autonomy and operational capability because they're struggling to keep fuel in them, that's going to negate their impact whenever those things do reach the field, if they ever do. Same with Bradley, potentially Stryker and stuff like that. So that's the aspect of why I think the Russians are kind of running against the clock to a degree, because Russia isn't the Soviet Union. Zaporizhzhia, the Russian tank plant, is turning out T-90s on Ms on a respectable rate from what I can see anecdotally, but we're talking about 5, 6, potentially 7 units a week, if even that. Russia isn't turning out hundreds of tanks a month. It's not the Soviet Union. I don't understand why people sort of have this idea it is. That's the way the Russian army is kind of going is it's going to be a two-tier force. You're going to have like a creme de la creme kind of force, which is kind of what it always was. The start of the war really showed that, is that the top crust of the Russian army is very good, very well equipped, and very well trained, and then the bottom half, at least at the start of the war, was complete dog poop, for lack of a better term. It was corrupt. It was poorly motivated. It was missing all kinds of equipment. There's some indication that some of those problems are slowly being rectified, but some of them are being rectified by pulling out some very old Soviet era equipment and putting them into mobilized battalions. So we're seeing this kind of weird dichotomy where you have certain Russian units are driving about in T90Ms, in BMP2s, model 2014s, and the latest BTR models, and then alongside them they're operating beside mobilized battalions that are operating T72As, or driving about in BMP1s, and are made up by mobilized troops, and they're not the most motivated and not the best equipped and not the best led. So we've kind of got again this two-tier Russian army coming to the fore again. Same's kind of true for the Ukrainians, but the difference is the overall thing I'm making is that the economic and the industrial potential of these countries at this stage greatly outweighs, and into the future will outweigh, the industrial and economic capability of the Russians to sustain the war. So if unless the Russians are looking to be in Ukraine for 10 years, fighting, grinding attritional battles, the Russians kind of need I don't want to say a plan to win the war, because I don't think that's on the cards at this stage, but ways to significantly put the hurt strategically on Ukraine, because ammunition and weapons production is slowly picking up, particularly in North America, but also European states are having their domestic ammunition and weapons producers pick up production as well, particularly looking at countries sort of like the Czech Republic. The Spanish, from my understanding, are greatly expanding their artillery shell production. The Poles, last week, I think it was, announced that they're looking to increase by 50% the production of their domestic anti-tank guided missile production, with the aspect the excess production with the base production, which was already going to Ukraine, is then going to be added with the excess production of this hypothetical 50% increase in production if they can achieve it. On top of that, the Poles have announced, this is where the Leopard 2s come into it, that part of the delivery of the consignment of Leopard 2s that the Poles will be getting from Germany is they want to send them straight to Poland. So the point is, what I'm saying is, yep, production is increasing in Russia, but at the same time, production is also increasing in the dozens of countries that make up NATO, and there is a lot more economic fat that can be put into the production lines here than there is here. So that's the point, is what I'm making about a bit of the time against the clock here for the Russians. The Russians kind of need to look, if not outright to sort of win a military victory in Ukraine, is to significantly degrade Ukraine to keep Russia significantly on the advantage going forward for the next year. And I think one of the good ideas around that would be the Zaporozhzhia offensive idea. Like I say, I really think if the Russians can really make this city into a bleeding wound for the Ukrainians, then there is things that can be achieved for Russia here. So with that, that's kind of the spiel, the great bulk of the stream's main content. So with that, I'll go into what's recently been happening. So just a quick catch up for what's happening elsewhere in the war. Pardon me. As I briefly touched on at the start of the stream, the Wagner group has been achieving fairly decent advances to the south of Bakhmut. They've pushed out from Optrony, forgive my pronunciation again, I'm not too sure. Well, this map tends to lean pro-Ukrainian, but as I said in my previous stream, actually addressing Soldar, from my understanding, this town of Kalichkiva has actually fallen to the Wagner group a few days ago, and they were implanting themselves along this hill so that they had overwatch and fire control on this road here. That was from my understanding. If that's still the case, I'm not too sure. Again, this map, this website I just use for the maps in general, it tends to take a more pro-Ukrainian bias. But from my understanding, this is currently held by the Wagner group. But interesting, this map, which I've also seen corroborated by other reports, is that the Wagner group was able to advance to the south of this river and start to push up towards the H32 road itself. The Wagner group has slowly been able to make tangential gains into Bakhmut itself. Optrony being the big example, this is the area around where the garbage dump is. If you really follow the battle for Bakhmut in and out, you might know of the garbage dump. It's in this general area. Wagner seems to have taken the area, but with a bit of caution. They've held it for a couple days now, but as anything that happens in Bakhmut, the garbage dump and up here is the petrol station and the cement works. These areas have gone back and forth across to either side several times in the past couple months, and dozens of times since the battle for Bakhmut began. So the Wagner group might start to be slowly making inroads into Bakhmut itself, but with the caveat they've done this before and they were repulsed every time they did it. But then again, the wider caveat is that the situation wider for Bakhmut is not as rosy as it was previously for the Ukrainian defenders of Bakhmut. Again, this road, from my understanding, is under Russian fire control. It's kind of cut off for resupply and reinforcement, but also crucially, the fall of Soldar to the north. The Wagner group is continuing seemingly to push on the offensive, a bit slow than what it was. But if the Wagner group is able to push down, as I was saying in the previous stream on Soldar, if you're really looking for the in-depth of this, as far as I understood it a few days ago, this area is a river valley. So this is high ground up here. This is high ground here. I'm not too sure on what the visuals are like in this area, but this is a hill here. And potentially the Russians, if they're able to put guns and anti-tank guided missiles up on this hill, might have a view of this road here, which is, especially if this road is under Russian fire control, one of the few remaining roads into Bakhmut that the Ukrainians can reliably bring in supplies and reinforcements. Well, if that's going to be coming under direct fire from the Russians, from Wagner itself, that's going to significantly degrade Ukrainian reinforcement and logistics into Bakhmut itself. And then alongside that, that is slowly going to degrade the defense of the city as well. Alongside that, there's some indication that the Wagner group is preparing to make a push down this river valley itself and physically try and take the crossroads here and just physically cut the road entirely. So if that happens, I think the Ukrainians would start to seriously look at potentially withdrawing from Bakhmut itself, because this would the ability to hold the city will start to become seriously problematic. Again, I believe this is a railroad. There are some small roads, but in general, they're not very big roads. Again, I went through my favorite autistic hobby of getting bizarrely well acquainted with road networks in Ukraine. They're one-lane roads, couple of two-lane roads, if even, at best, and in the kind of frozen now, but whenever it rains, they're barely roads at all. So that's the same for the roads, the fields around the roads. You're not going to get any heavy vehicles, trucks in and out of Bakhmut, especially as spring, whenever it starts to come in the spring, and the spring rains come. Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't want to be in Bakhmut at that stage if that's the scenario that starts to come back. So there's some speculation that the Ukrainians might start to look at withdrawing from the city. So that's something to look out for in the coming weeks. Alongside that, it should be said that the Ukrainians aren't really releasing their reserves in to stabilize this sector, which is interestingly, the troops in Bakhmut are the ones that have been holding the position for months now. As I was saying, there is a Ukrainian army group that seems to have disappeared, and there's significant Ukrainian reserves out here. Again, speculation is that they're looking to pull off their own offensive at some point. The key thing is that they're still being held in reserve. They have not been put into the fight in the Bakhmut area to try and stabilize and push back Wagner. So maybe they're just waiting for the time where the Wagner group or the Russians start to overextend themselves around the Bakhmut sector, and then they might try a counterattack then. But that's something to look out for in the future. But also, interestingly, the Wagner group has started to push north from Soledar up. The fall of Soledar has sort of undermined the Ukrainian defenses along the northern flank of the Bakhmut front. If, again, this is all heavily defended Ukrainian lines, well, now they've got a bleeding wound to their rear and to their south. So Ukrainian assets might start to withdraw from this defensive line, which will then start to push the Ukrainians back to Seversk, and potentially, finally, this small sliver of Luhansk Oblast, which I think is the... No, this is Luhansk as well. Okay. This area here, and Bilhorovka was the only part of Luhansk Oblast that the Ukrainians ever really held. They briefly lost it for a couple of weeks, but then they retook it. Up until the Kharkov offensive, this was the only area of Luhansk Oblast that the Ukrainians held. If the Russians are, well, if the Wagner group, it's more the Wagner group rather than the Russians, are able to undermine the Ukrainian defensive line here and force them back, that, I guess they can't really claim that because of this area, but, you know, it removes that sore pot, that's Ukrainian strong point near Lysychansk out of the equation. Just on this point, Bilhorovka, if people can remember back during the summer, whenever there was the catastrophic Russian attempt to cross the river, which got hit by Ukrainian artillery, and then Ukrainians tried to cross it in the same area and seemed to have gotten destroyed as well. That is just along this part of the river in the Bilhorovka area, so just if you're trying to understand the connotations of this area. So, I'll be a bit autistic and just have a look at this road. So this is, again, just to emphasize the point on the roads. Whenever you're talking about war, especially the war in Ukraine, roads are key, infrastructure is key. Yellow, this is meant to be a main road, but it is only a 2-lane road. So it's not even a very particularly big road. So that smaller road I was looking at earlier on, as you can see, it's marked on the map, but this is a dirt track by the looks of it. So if it isn't already, whenever rains come, good luck trying to get tanks or trucks across that area. That looks to be this road as well. That's a paved road, but that looks like it's got a line down the middle, but that's effectively a 1-lane road as well by the looks of it. So they're the things to kind of think of whenever you're talking about battles and Bakhmut and the like. So trying to say, you can't really see is there an elevation angle to this map? Traffic cycle, terrain. Doesn't really show up as well as I would like, but as you can sort of see, it's a bit of high ground here, but this is a river valley. And then that's the heights that the Russians took, and well, Wagner took them in Soledar, which allowed them to effectively push the Ukrainians back out of the town. this up on the hill. Looking down in the soul, which is the direction we're looking at here. Taken in August 2020. Can't quite. Is there a compass that tells me which direction I'm looking at? Oh, pardon me. No. Can't quite see it from here. I'm just trying to see if there happen to be any things that might have given us a sight of the hill, so we could try and get this. Oh, pardon me. Okay, here we go. This is kind of what I was looking for here. So as you can see, this is, I'm assuming that must be Soldar, the salt mine. So this is looking to the east. So that must be the west out over there. So it'd be better if we had a picture from this angle, but you can imagine this is the kind of view that you have down onto Soldar. And that sort of area, it kind of gives you an idea of the height here. So so that must be, Bakhmut must be down somewhere in that direction. Oh wait, that's the sun setting. The sun sets in the, oh good lord. Which direction does the sun set in again? Sets in the west. Yeah. So that's the west over there. So Bakhmut must be down in that sort of area. So that must be the salt mine just on the western edge of Soldar. So that road that we're talking about must run along there, along this forest. So Bakhmut will be just down in around there. So yeah. Yeah, if the Wagner is able to put some kind of decent long range weaponry up on this height, potentially they could nip off anything trying to come down this road here. Because if I've got my bearings right, I believe either this tree line or that, maybe that tree line there, is where the road runs along. So you go back to the satellite. There's the tree line there. And looking south along there. There's those, okay, that kind of complicates it a bit. There's trees running either side of the road, which would, I guess, complicate visuals onto the road itself, but I guess you could potentially burn the trees, but yeah, it complicates it a little bit. But nonetheless, if Wagner is able to, I guess maybe not direct, but indirect fire onto the road and start to push down this valley to actually physically cut the road, it would have the same effect and just put more stress on the Ukrainian defense of Bakhmut. So, and if I'm not mistaken, there was actually some decently sized roads for my hypothetical Russian offensive into Zaporozhzhia. Oh, that's a real network. So yeah, unless you guys want to be as autistic as me and examine every single bridge on the Dnieper River, like I did a few days ago, to see which ones potentially, yeah, see there's the dam, but this part of the dam, there's like a road span across it. So if you could collapse part of the road span, you effectively put it out. And then you'd also have the added aspect, I guess, if you hit the electrical grid of putting the electrics out. See, my idea again for this is not to completely cut off the city. You still want the Ukrainians to be able to feed in assets, but not significant assets that they could, say, for example, counterattack out of the city and push you back from it. But at that stage, I think you guys probably don't want to spend the next hour being autistic as me and looking at bridges and roads. But just on a side note, we all think of the Soviet Union as like, if it can't feed its people, at least it could build lots of roads, bridges, and highways. It's actually surprising how little infrastructure. I kind of made the point last year in a stream. I forget which one it was, but it's kind of surprising just how little connections east and west Ukraine has across the Dnieper. I mean, this is what, a good 1,200 miles of river across a very significant European country. A very, very strategic and industrialized part of the Soviet Union. And like the amount of bridges across it is surprisingly sparse, because if people can remember back to the Kherson stream, the Antonovsky Bridge and there's this rail bridge to the side of it, is the only crossing on the south of the Dnieper, apart from the Kakhovka Dam. And even then, those two, again, it minus the rail bridge, the dam and the Antonovsky Bridge are the only road connections from the east to the west, all the way up until Zaporizhzhia, which is something like, I think it's like a good 150 miles potentially upstream. And then you got quite a few bridges here. There's quite a few bridges in Dnipro, and then there's a couple in Kamyansk, and then in Kremenchuk. But beyond that, I mean, like, I don't know. I just found it surprising just how few bridges there tend to be, connections. And then this adds to the other aspect. For, again, you expected the Soviet Union to be building bridges, roads, and highways and stuff everywhere. Going back to my early streams, whenever I first started streaming on this stuff, like the connections between Belarus and Ukraine are actually surprisingly sparse. And even from Russia into Ukraine, granted, most of the Russian connections were kind of severed post 2014, but even then, they're just surprisingly few, both from the Soviet era and from the post-Soviet era. But with that just autistic little ramble out of the way, what do you guys have to say? Has anyone got any questions, any insights? Oh, bunker housing for 20 Swedish krones. Thank you so much. How viable kill a bridge with a sup missile? What's a sup? Is that supersonic? Again, I'm not the massive expert on munitions themselves, but just anecdotally looking at what was purported to be the damage of the Kizil supersonic missile that hit in western Ukraine back in March. I don't see why, if one of those were to hit a bridge, it wouldn't, if not significantly degrade, if not potentially collapse part of the bridge's span. And Baldon is burning a Quran outside Turkey embassy to anger the Turks to make NATO membership difficult. Oh, must be some Swedish stuff then. I'm not familiar with Paladin. But I mean, the Turks are more nationalistic than they were Islamist, from my understanding. But those Western tanks are no good. Expensive, complex, and needs lots of fuel and batteries and all that against the ATGMs. Come on. Okay, so what are you saying here? That Russian tanks have been faring better? I mean, outside of the T-90M, I mean, like, the Russians don't really have anything that comes up against apart from, like, the more modernized, like the really ultra-modern T-72s, but even then, I don't think they're quite up to the standard of a Challenger 2. Depends on what model of Leopard in Abrams. I mean, like, Western tanks have a doctrine of their own. It was quality over quantity. That's why the Russians have thousands of T-72s to spit out, because the Soviet doctrine was to flood NATO defenses, whereas NATO tanks were built for a different purpose. And I mean, like, I just don't understand this idea that I don't know why I'm engaging with it, because it's just typical. If I was in charge of the troops in Belarus, I would do a lot more small scale raids. I don't think that's really. I'm not too sure how much that would really achieve. There's quite a lot of Ukrainian troops along the border, and I think if Russians were to start doing raids across the border, I think that's going to start pissing off Belarus, and also start because Lukashenko and the Belarusians are content to have the Russians in the country and to launch maybe air to ground missiles and rockets from Belarus. But if Russian troops, they launched the invasion initially, but if the Russians were to really start pinprick attacks into Ukraine and the Ukrainians were to respond by firing stuff into Belarus, I don't really think that the Belarusian military is up to the standard to really go to war with Ukraine at this stage. And also, what would these raids really achieve? I don't really see the need for it. Whenever you achieve enough by offloading your mobilized troops into Belarus to get trained by the Belarusians, by doing that, you're also tying down Ukrainian troops along the border for the hypothetical scenario that they might reinvade across the border. It's a win-win for the Russians to just keep a tense peace on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border at this stage. Soviet doctrine was good enough versus Western quality over quantity. Yeah, I mean, Soviet doctrine, that's why Soviet tanks are so much smaller. We went through the previous stream where we compared a T-72s to Leopards and Abrams in Challengers. Western tanks are massive compared to them. They're bigger targets, definitely, but generally, that's because Western tanks have a lot more in them. They have a lot more armor going on them. The counteract to that would be the Russian T-90M, which is significantly beefier than other T-90s. But I mean, just look at the T-72s, guys. If you're really disputing this idea, what do you think all those blocks all over the T-72 are? It's explosive reactive armor, because the base armor of the T-72, it's been upgraded and it's gotten better over the years, but it's not really sufficient in and of itself. So you have to put add-on armor on top of it. Whereas the Challenger and to a degree the Abrams, but certainly the Leopard 2, were built to be, I don't want to say indestructible, but the armor was the selling point of them. It was because these were the things that were expected to go toe-to-toe against the Soviet Tank Guards army and slug it out with Soviet tanks. The Soviet counter to that was their tanks were smaller in size, so a smaller target, and also they could fire generally more rounds quicker through the autoloader, but and they were also tended to be faster, at least on the road, because one, they were smaller. But it's just I just don't. Yeah. Tanks versus tanks is rare. Tanks have many purpose, even the T-64. Yeah, a tank is a tank. A tank's always useful in this war. Even the T-55s that they got from Slovenia are pretty, they're pretty dog shit. If those go up even against some of the really poor quality Russian tanks, I'd take the really poor Russian quality tank to the T-55 that the Ukrainians have gotten, but nonetheless, it is a big gun that can move about. So I think, it has a utility of its own. Even if it wouldn't be very good, but even if someone was to bring out a T-34 out of a museum, well, it's got a big gun and it can do damage at stuff it fires. So even it has a bit of utility. What do you think the frontline borders will look like at the end of this war if the Russians do what you recommend? Well, I mean, if the Russians do my sort of idea and it goes well, I mean, it kind of opens up for them to just start to nibble away at eastern Ukraine and start to push into Donbass. It's kind of gone a bit unreported, but the Russians are expanding mobilization. They're using a few legal tricks to kind of hide it, but let's just say the 300,000 the Russians said they were mobilized. Well, I think it's pushing up to 500,000 now. They're looking at, well, from what I can see, it seems to be that they're looking at rotation of mobilized troops. So they'll build up a training system to push through hundreds of thousands of troops every few months, push into the field, and then to pull others out of mobilization. So I mean, the Russians are building up for this to go on for quite a while. But saying that, I think it all depends on the coming offensives that we're expecting in the spring. If both go poorly and the lines don't really change for whatever reason here or there, I kind of suspect that the war might just become a larger scale conflict in the Donbass, where both sides have kind of fought themselves into this sort of quasi stalemate, and the war effectively degrades into small scale skirmishes here or there and artillery duels. But then there'll be some kind of, I don't want to say Minsk style agreement, but there'll be some kind of tacit agreement that large scale hostilities have ended, and now it's kind of 2015 to 2022 kind of Donbass tier cold conflict kind of thing. I hope Russia will take Odessa this year. I did a stream specifically dealing with that last year. No, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Kherson is a very far off goal for the Russians right now. Getting across this river, the Russians really pulled a hat trick by being to achieve it with surprise during the opening of the war, but at this stage, trying to get back to the west for the Dnieper for the Russians is going to be a very tall order, and I don't think it's very feasible at all, really, unless something radically changes. Michael has always been hung up on tanks as a decisive factor. I've never really claimed it's a decisive factor, but I mean it's a pretty key factor. ERA is for poor people. I mean, ERA is effective when it's used properly. It's going to be interesting to see if the Ukrainians put ERA on their Challengers and potentially their Leopards and Abrams. Will be an interesting sight. Did anyone forget to mention the significant the rain brings? It's possible that people forgot. Yeah. But temperatures dropped quite a lot across Ukraine. There seems to be an Arctic flare coming in from Siberia, so I don't think the rain might be as crucial for a couple of weeks yet. Would you date Giza? Okay. She lives in Belarus. No, she lives in Siberia. Manny Horowitz was from Odessa. I don't know who that is. It's not just armor. Western tanks, i.e. real tanks, have far superior optics, ballistics, computer, general fire control efficiency. There's no competition. Largely I would agree, but like I say, some of them, the really modern T-72s and certainly the T-90s, certainly the T-90M, I think they are more than a capable match for I mean, like, as good as the Challenger is and the Leopard, and to a degree the Abrams, they are fairly dated systems at this stage. Yes, they've got modern variants, but I mean, the Challenger 2 is kind of round. When did it come out? Like 1997. The Abrams been there in one form or another since the 1980s. It all depends on what model. There really isn't many models of Challenger. It's kind of the same base system all the way through. But it depends on what model of Leopard and Abrams, I guess they send. But I think that certainly the T-90s, the T-90M especially, would be more than adequate. I don't want to say a match, but I think they would certainly give these Western tanks a run for their money, depending on what model they are. ballistics computers. Ballistics computers is like targeting, adjusting elevation, like how far away a target is, where you need to aim the tank and stuff. Western tanks are too heavy for many Ukrainian bridges, and all their engineer bridging equipment as well is the supply of tank transporter light. I don't know, I'm skeptical of that idea. Like, yeah, they're not really going to field well during the autumn and the spring in open country, but then again, what tank doesn't? What truck doesn't? Now it sounds like Michael is drunk. I am not drunk. I haven't drank in a long time. I fought with warriors and operated around challengers, so these tanks are obsolete in this new era. Well, I mean, in a battlefield completely dominated by anti-tank guided missiles, yeah, but they still have utility of their own. And I mean, if challengers are obsolete, then how? Well, or tanks in general obsolete. Like, how is the Challenger worse than a T-90 in this battlefield potentially? Like, Challenger 2 uses non-standard ammunition, and all of it will have yeah, like as I've said in the Telegram channel numerous times, yeah, the Ukrainian logistics system is going to be an absolute shit show. Trying to juggle Soviet era tanks with a plethora of Western vehicles, getting parts at the correct ammunition, all that stuff. Yeah, I do not want to be a Ukrainian logistician in the months and years to come ahead, but it will eventually get through in one form or another. That's why what I would say it is in the interest of why, like, I think the Zaporozhye thing is a good idea for the Russians to complicate this logistics system, to put pressure on it, to take its focus off certain issues and onto supporting a bleeding wound in the south, to close off as many avenues from west to east across the Dnieper as they can. So whenever the Ukrainians come to hypothetically be very strained in how much and what they can get across the Dnieper, they have to choose very tactically, because it's very strained, because the Russians have taken out the bridges hypothetically, or something along those lines, is to put as much stress and strain on that system. So that system, as complicated as it is, and it will be complicated, but then it will also be stressed. So while you're trying to juggle a myriad of different parts to keep your Bradleys, your BMPs, your French VABs, your Dutch supplied M113s, your British supplied Challengers, to keep those running in the field. On top of that, you also have to deal with, well, your consignment of this parts was destroyed because the bridge it was crossing got hit with a Kizal missile, or there's a massive roadblock on the few remaining bridges in Kiev from west to east because of all the civilian population east of the Dnieper is trying to get out of a looming humanitarian crisis because they can't get the food in to support them, or the truck carrying it from the one remaining bridge across Circassy got into a car accident outside Poltava. Like, you know, it's things like that. Modern Russian APF SDS campaign, the Leo 2 A4 early batch tanks fairly easily, apparently. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the 2A4, that's like, what, the 1980s? Of course, the inverse is also true of various modern NATO sabos for the RH-120 variants. Odessa will not be taken. Russia doesn't want to be known as the ones who damaged the city. Oh, pardon me. Oh, pardon me. My ice cream dinner isn't sitting well. Foreign contractors eventually to repair or no? I don't know if this is a discussion at me or one in the chat. I say why not? Russia is using Iran military to maintain and train the Shahid launchers and drones. Even trade that Russia can't Spider-Man meme out. Okay. There's always possibility of bait and switch with sending Polish PT-91s, that we still have plenty, instead of throwing lots of small batches of Leos and Challengers. If I'm not mistaken, the kind of running implication is that the Poles will send the Twardies at some point. The whole point of them upgrading to Abrams, the KA-2 and the Leopards, was to start to send off the T-72Ms and then eventually the Twardies. So alongside small batches of Leopards, we'll probably at some point see all the Polish Twardies as well go. Okay, and is that everything? So don't know if I can really scroll all the way back up. I should really shield the super chat option a lot more. Yeah, guys, if you want to keep me happy, nice and warm with cheese and gravy chips whenever the blizzard ends, highly recommend sending a nice dono super chat. Keeps me happy. Any other questions, guys? Or are we gonna? I agree with Michael about Zaporizhzhia. Strong push up to the Dnieper with an offensive north of Kiev, plus a right-wing push around would roll up eastern Ukraine. No, that's not what I'm saying, because I don't think that's feasible. I mean, the Russians have a few 100,000 men. To achieve this, you're talking potentially around about 1 million. And a push on Kiev from the north, like what's in some kind of colossal encirclement of all of eastern Ukraine, I don't think that's especially feasible. I think what's far more feasible is these smaller offensives, looking at regional significance. So say if the Russians really do well in Zaporozhye, who knows, maybe in the summer, if things go well for the Russians elsewhere, the Russians could potentially launch a summer offensive up towards Kramatorsk into the Slovyansk and into the rear of the Donbass, or maybe the situation could come to it where the Russians decide, okay, we've taken Zaporozhye, let's complicate Ukrainian logistics even more, let's make a play for Dnipro and pull off the same scheme there, although the terrain around Dnipro looks diabolically complicated. Plus most of the city is bisected, but yeah, maybe the Russians could figure that out. While this bleeding wound is open, try and replicate it again in a more complex and complicated way around Dnipro. Slowly hop their way up the Dnieper, hollow out Ukraine from the west, well, eastern Ukraine from the west. Then who knows, after that, slowly tie up the Donbass and then maybe start looking at Kharkov if the war still goes on. So like that's just one feasible way, because this whole idea that the Russians aren't after territory, they're just trying to destroy the Ukrainian army. No. The Russians aren't really doing a Verdun here. It's not feasible. There are millions of Ukrainian men and women that are willing to come to the banner, and they've got almost an endless supply of Western equipment and supplies that can come into them. So the idea that the Russians can just sort of Verdun-style battle Ukraine into submission, I don't think that's very feasible. This war is going to be won whenever, well, if it is going to be won by either side, it will be won because one side has taken the territory and forced the other into submission. That's how this war will be won. And it's hard for me at this stage to conceive of what a Ukrainian victory, like if the Ukrainians completely push the Russians out of the south and east, which I don't think they ever will do. I do not see how the Ukrainians could ever retake Donetsk and Luhansk and it not being a massive open sore and wound, and the Russians just decide contently to stay on the eastern side of the border. So a Ukrainian victory to me seems rather ethereal and hard to contemplate, but I can see the road open to a Russian victory in some sense, but that's only if the Russians are able to get a bit of maneuver back into their military, into their army, and start actually retaking ground and start defeating the Ukrainian army via a war of maneuver, by outmaneuvering them, by encircling them, by completely crippling them, by just outmatching the Ukrainian army in the field, not the that sit behind an artillery force for 6 months while it slowly gets whittled away by HIMARS, and we just level every town and village we come across in an artillery duel, and let's empty the prison colonies and send them off into these suicidal charges into the Ukrainian lines. Like, that's not very feasible. And I think that's what the Russians, well, not what I've just said, I think the Russians have cottoned on to this idea. Again, that's why I think the fight around Soledar and Bakhmut is Wagner's fight. This is the Wagner group tying down the Ukrainians here. The Russian army, largely, at least in this part of the front, seems absent from its own war. They're preparing for something. And like I say, my stream tonight is just kind of giving you one hypothetical scenario I conceived of. But yeah, the Russian army is absent from the field because it's preparing for something big in the coming weeks. And is it going to be big in the sense that the damp squib of the Donbass offensive last year was, or is it going to be big in the sense that it's going to be like the opening stages of the invasion, but without the rank and competence, the corrupt nature of the officers that sold off the fuel, motivated troops led by competent officers who understand their tasks and are willing to fight to achieve them? You know, that's kind of where I am at this stage. That's where I'm looking. Well, that's kind of where I think the Russians might start to be veering in the near future. What's the current Challenger 1 M1 kill ratio against the T-72? Something like 100 to 1. Well, no Challenger's ever actually been... Oh, Challenger 1? I don't know. I don't know if any Challenger 1s have ever been destroyed in combat. I don't think any Abrams have been destroyed due to action from a T-72. You're going to... chat will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but from my understanding, was it the Battle of Easting? I think it was destroyed by anti-tank guided missiles, but I don't think that was an Abrams, that was a Bradley. And most, if not all, Abrams combat kills have been a result of IEDs. So I'm afraid I couldn't give you that off the top of my head. Do you think it's possible the Russian army will push on the west side of Ukraine to cut off supplies of weapons? No, you must have missed my part about 15 minutes, 20 minutes ago. No, that is not a feasible plan at all. I don't know why people think it is. One, you expect the Poles to just quietly sit by and allow it. Two, you expect all the Ukrainians to the east to just kind of not attack it. And, I mean, what's the idea here? That you're going to physically hug this Polish border, which is really going to get the Poles very tasty. And you're going to advance the 600 miles to the border of Romania and hold, well, one, take all that territory, and two, hold it, when this is what the Russians were able to achieve with the element of surprise at the start of the war. It's just not a feasible scenario. And on top of that, you kind of miss this border down here. And there's weapons that transfer via Moldova. Not officially, the Moldovans try and hide it, but there is NATO equipment that transits via Romania, via Moldova into Ukraine. So I mean, it's just not a feasible scenario. I don't understand why people sort of have the idea that that could happen. Jaeger 1447 for $10 US. Thank you so much. Thank you for remaining moored to reality in your analysis and commentary. Thank you. I do try. Are nukes on the table? I don't think, especially no. Yeah, for real, I'm glad I found this channel finally someone who isn't blinded by a bias. Thank you. I do appreciate that. I wish more people would say it in my chat. Yes, the USA is typically known as America. Are you planning to collaborate with DPA? Who's DPA? I'm afraid I'm not familiar. Aren't the Zaporozhye civilians Russians, according to Moscow? Wouldn't that make putting the civilians at risk as your plan might be a bit of a bad look? I don't think the Russians really care about like actual optics at this stage. Going by that logic, why are the Russians shelling Kherson City day in, day out now? Yeah, all's fair in love and war. And then also on top of that, the people in Zaporozhye, even if they wanted to, did not have an option to vote in the referenda. I don't know if it's actually on a stream or not, but I did raise the interesting legal quandary of Zaporozhye because more people actually live in Zaporozhye city than they do in Russian-held Zaporozhye. So even, like, we all know it wasn't a fair referendum, but say if it was like a fair referendum, how do you square that legally when more people lived outside of the area, which you don't control, than voted in the area you do control, but yet you're going to claim the area that you don't control is part of the area that you do control? It's just an interesting little legal autism. When will you stop? Never. I don't know. Whenever I lose interest in this, I guess, but I guess I'm kind of in it for the long haul. The Bakhmut fight is mostly just that the prisoners are sent en masse onto the Ukrainians, and that is why it is actually going positively for the Russians. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of a bit fucked up morally, but like I do think it's kind of a win-win what Wagner's been doing for Russia in Bakhmut. I mean, you clear out the scum from the penal colonies, the rapists, the thieves, the people who aren't going to be missed in Russia. You give them a rifle and you tell them, okay, go find redemption. You know, redeem yourself in death, or if you do somehow survive, okay, we'll give you a new start. And then the flip side of that is vast majority of them seem to be finding redemption in death. So Russia is clearing out the prisons. It's kind of like in a bleak way. It's kind of a win-win, I guess, for Russian society, as it were. You're kind of putting the scum to some kind of use. But the way Putin is to say great speeches, I know. Tomorrow, Putin is to say, there's Putin's speech tomorrow. I'll have to look into that. Oh, pardon me. Abrams burned in the center of Baghdad, 2003. Yeah, it was an RPG. Well, then again, find me a tank that isn't going to be destroyed by an RPG hit to the engine block. Like if Abrams do turn up in mass in Ukraine, like in a year or two, then that's whenever the Russian strategic fuel camp bombing would really start to come to play in its own, because like the Abrams especially is notoriously fuel hungry. That's, you know, if you're trying to field a fleet of those, that's whenever you start really bombing the fuel depots, because that's when it's going to hurt. Nine Abrams destroyed, 7 by friendly fire and 2 by Iraq to prevent. Collab with the Duran. I think I'm okay. Because it's about Russian, ethnic Russians. Okay. Hi Michael, do you think you could do a stream with another YouTuber? Perun would be an excellent quest in my opinion. I think I'm probably pretty small fry and an amateur, to be honest, for someone like Perun. I'm always generally happy unless the person's like a convicted nonce or is like has some really dodgy thing going on. I'm not into the habit of inviting myself onto other people's streams, but if someone asks, I'm always happy to come in and chime in for a bit. Stop the stream, not the okay. It's got a jet engine, yep. And with that, any final questions before I sort of round it out? If anyone has anything else they want me to chime in on? while we're waiting for the last couple of questions, I would just like to say, if you do like this kind of content, if you do feel I provide something of worth, I haven't linked it, but I'll update the edit. It always helps to, even if it's just £1 or $1, especially if it's a monthly thing via PayPal or Coffee. It's all greatly appreciated. It helps keep this all a bit sustainable, and keeps me fed with cheesy chips and stuff. So if you do mind that stuff, I'll update the edit of the video to include the links. I should have done it here, to be honest, before I started this stream, but I was too lazy. I'll probably do that now. But if you go into the it all helps, is what I'm trying to say at the end of the day, and it's greatly appreciated. So anyone who has done that, or if you're minded to do that, thank you so much. It is greatly appreciated. But we've got a couple more stuff that's just come in now. Let me just check. Okay. Can I update this while it's live? Apologies, I'm just checking if I have learned something new from you. Yep. So links are now in the description if that's something you might be interested in helping out with. Cough cough history legends. How important is this war to them is the question. Defense Politics Asia. I've seen their videos advertised to me on YouTube, but I can't say I've ever watched any of their content, so I don't have an idea off the top of my head. Testing chat wasn't working for me, seeing if it works now. Yeah, I'm seeing it now. No, I didn't see any other posts apart from the start of the stream from you, Maureen. Apparently the APUs and other modifications have ameliorated the Abrams fuel issues to some extent, but that's on more recent variants. Yeah, and again, it should be stressed, I guess the Challenger is kind of due to go out of service, but it's not really. And the Leopards as well, but the stuff like the Bradleys, we'll have to keep a close eye on what model of Bradley does go. And it should be said, I'm just speculating on the Abrams. There has been no announcement so far that the Abrams will be sent to Ukraine, but it is kind of implicit with various countries announcing that they will send them. But if Abrams do go to Ukraine, I don't think they're going to be the M1A2 Tusk variants or whatever. You know, they're going to be the older variants, the stuff that's been probably the old Marine Corps Abrams that have been retired. That's the kind of stuff that the Americans will probably clear out to Ukraine. Coffee is a waste of money. I don't drink coffee, but the donation account thing that I use is called Coffee, KOFI. The link is in the description. But yeah, I hate the taste of coffee. Just view it if you would like to buy me a Coke. Do you think Russia will win? Nuanced. That's a bit hard to cover. It's a pretty broad subject. Did someone happen with you? I think that's meant to be something. No. Felix has just kind of been out. I mean, he went back to the Far East, and he has some things going on in his life at the moment, so he's just kind of taken a step back from all this stuff. So at some point, hopefully we'll restart the streams. Why have your last couple of streams not saved on your YouTube channel? Do you have them set to auto delete? Like some of the really poor quality streams I don't put up, but I mean generally if you make sure you click on the live button on the channel and not the video button, they're showing up as live streams because I'm just leaving them up as live streams. I'm not really editing them down into a video form at this point. Pardon me. To be honest, Felix is kind of blinded by his anti-Western bias. I mean, I'm pretty anti-Western as well. Felix is just black-pilled about everything. To be honest, I'm pretty black-pilled as well about the West in general. I want a decent, sustainable alternative to the West. Every side can win, I think. Cheers, Michael. Stay warm. Thank you very much. And okay. With that, is there any last-minute ones? Oh, pardon me. Oh wow, I can send myself a super chat. I didn't know that. But then YouTube takes like a quarter of the money, isn't it? So, rightio. I think that might be it. There's no more coming in. So, thanks very much, guys. How long have we been going on for? We're going on for just around about 2 hours, 10 minutes. Again, hope some people got some stuff out of this that was worth it. Like I say, this is mostly a hypothetical scenario about potential scenarios going forward. At least my envisaged what I would do if I kind of was running the show about the upcoming offensive. You missed my super chat. Sorry, whereabouts? Which one? Jaeger. Insert ad? No, I don't want to insert. How do I bring up? I need to figure out how. Okay. If Ukraine army collapses, Odessa will be taken. Yeah, but I don't think the Ukrainian army is going to collapse. Yeah. I think the Ukrainian army is probably going to be standing for quite a while yet. Every war Moscow has fought for the past 100 years has been a show for the first year or two. Then they adapt with sacrificing lives of millions of men. How important is winning the war? People always use that argument, but they tend to forget the First World War, Afghanistan, the First Chechen War. I mean, history might rhyme, but it isn't indicative of the end result. And also, I mean, everyone points to the Great Patriotic War, but I mean, like, is Russia really going to have to lose a quarter of its territory and population to Ukraine before it decides to, like, really start winning the war? I mean, the one about that if Ukrainian army collapse, Russia will take Odessa. Afghanistan got better before they quit. We're not saying they'll always win, but it always starts like and can change. Yeah. Potentially, but okay. So with that, I'm going to round it off here. Again, if you guys get something out of it, like I say, I'd encourage you very humbly to potentially, even if it's just £1, $1, a rupee, a hryvnia, a ruble a month, on a monthly thing on Coffee or via PayPal, or even if it's just a one-off. It's all greatly appreciated. Like I say, it helps me kind of, especially if it's a monthly, it helps me kind of budget for stuff going ahead. Or if it's just one-off, that's greatly appreciated as well. Other than that, I'd encourage you to check out either my Telegram, my Instagram, or the Odyssey channel, which I kind of need to re-engage with a bit more. And I'm assuming most people here are part of the Telegram group already. So with that, okay, how do the comparison with Russian offensive wars? At best, it will end with a Russian border along the skeptical. But yeah, with that, I'm going to sign out here, guys. So thank you. Hope you all have a good night, and thank you for coming along. And I should be streaming at some point this week to play The Forest again with Giza. Some people seem to have enjoyed that. It's kind of a nice to get away from the hard politics and just chill out. But also, depending how things go in the next couple of days, I might do another stream on Soldar and Bakhmut, depending how the situation develops there. So, with that, thank you very much, guys. Hope you have a good night and speak to you all soon. See ya. Bye.